Machiavelli and Hamilton both predicted the administrative state coup against President Donald Trump. Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button. Today we're going to be talking about the so-called administrative state. These are the agencies and departments within the executive branch of the federal government that these days doesn't appear to answer to either the president or Congress. They've taken on lawmaking powers of Congress and many of the executive powers of the president that were traditionally delegated under the federal Constitution's Article 1 and Article 2. And this is basically a mutation in the modern era since World War II with how the executive branch has functioned. In 2015, shortly before the presidential election cycle began to enter into full swing, I had written a piece called A Warning from the Author of The Prince, where I was focused on this administrative state and its basically usurpation of lawmaking powers of Article 1. And I was really focused on Congress. And what I hadn't considered at the time, we were looking at lots of examples, the carbon endangerment finding in 2009. This was regulating carbon dioxide as a harmful pollutant under the terms of the Clean Air Act. This was done in accordance with a Supreme Court ruling, Massachusetts v. EPA from 2007, that gave the agency permission to do this. And what it meant was basically that they were going to rewrite the terms of the Clean Air Act to include carbon dioxide. In any event, I was looking at this warning from Niccolo Machiavelli in Discourses on Livy. He had written that in addition to his more famous classic, The Prince, on what might have happened if the first Brutus had not slayed the last Roman king and established a republic, and how it might have been impossible to ever reform Rome. In 1517, he wrote, quote, "When one considers how much corruption there was in those kings, if 2 or 3 successive reigns had continued the same way, and that corruption was in them had spread to members of the body politic, it would no longer have been possible to reform Rome." Unlike in The Prince here, you can see that Machiavelli actually has a preference for Republican, lowercase Republican forms of government over principalities. And he was laying out the conditions for maintaining a republic, and therefore liberty was virtue or love of liberty by the people and by the representatives. Lacking this virtue, then, people can become ambivalent to the politics of their society and those in power and who have access and are the true participants in politics. Out of fear or out of ambivalence, the people's role is cast to the side. They're on the outside looking in, and the people themselves become corrupted in the sense that they are unable and unwilling to participate any longer in the civil society, and freedom is lost. The people will become more focused on their private lives, and having become disconnected from the process, leave politics to the powerful. Now, at the time in 2015, again, I was looking at Congress abdicating its responsibilities under Article 1 to these administrative state agencies. And this is done under the Administrative Procedures Act. It's also insulated by other reforms, including the Hatch Act, that makes it impossible, next to impossible, to fire federal bureaucrats. And again, we mentioned the EPA carbon endangerment finding as an example. I had also noted the Department of Housing and Urban Development did a regulation in 2015 called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing that sought to condition $3 billion of community development block grants given to more than 1,200 counties and cities nationwide on making changes to local zoning in accordance with racial or income guidelines. We've noted the outsourcing of the nation's monetary policy via the Federal Reserve in 1913, or the fact that has made law that 86% of the federal budget gets spent whether or not Congress votes to appropriate monies at all on an annual basis, despite constitutional provisions stating that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury except in consequence of appropriations made by Congress. And so that includes so-called mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest payments, plus a good chunk of the so-called discretionary budget once you factor in essential employees, defense spending that always gets spent, even if there's a partial government shutdown. Now, I'd focused on these legislative delegations of authority, and I'd held out hope that a new president working with Congress might be able to kind of rein in this administrative state. And part of Machiavelli's warning said that a single person could implement reform, but that it might not be long lasting. And so I kind of took this as, well, maybe a president can do this. Quote, if a city has begun to decline because of the corruption of its material, and if it ever happens to pull itself up again, this happens because of the ability of a single man living at the time and not because of the ability of the people supporting its good institutions. And as soon as that man is gone, it returns to its former ways, unless the reformers, before passing on, have managed to bring about her rebirth. Meaning time matters. I wrote at the time that therefore winning an election would not be enough. Whoever the next president is, regardless of the political party, he or she will have to be dedicated to ensuring that the people's representatives are the ones who make laws and appropriate funds on an annual basis. I didn't know it at the time because President Trump had not yet descended the escalator at Trump Tower. He hadn't started running for president when I wrote the piece. But Machiavelli's prescient warning most certainly applied to him and his promises to drain the swamp. So he appears on the scene in 2015. He runs for president. He says he's going to drain the swamp. He's going to take on these official bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. Alexander Hamilton also had a warning in Federalist number 70, where he lays out, I think, the unitary executive theory under Article 2, this legal doctrine that we read Article 2 as having a unitary executive. So therefore, we only have one president at a time who is authorized under the Constitution to execute the laws, and he's the buck stops there, was kind of the idea there. Quote, wherever two or more persons are engaged in a common enterprise or pursuit, there is always danger of difference of opinion, if it be a public trust or office in which they are clothed with equal dignity and authority. There's a peculiar danger of personal emulation and even animosity from either, and especially from all these causes. The most bitter dissensions are apt to spring, leading to, quote, whenever these happen, they lessen the respectability, weaken the authority, and distract the plans and operation of those whom they divide. If they should unfortunately assail the supreme executive of the country, consisting of a plurality of persons, they might impede or frustrate the most important measures of the government in the most critical emergencies of the state. And what is still worse, they might split the community into the most violent and irreconcilable factions, adhering differently to the different individuals who compose the executive. Now, little did Trump or the nation know at the time in 2015 when he started running for office, although Machiavelli and Hamilton probably wouldn't have been surprised, was that Trump was going to be elected and that he would have to contend with unprecedented sabotage by the administrative deep state, these intelligence agencies and the Justice Department that falsely accused President Trump of being Russian agent based upon allegations compiled by the DNC and Hillary Clinton hired Fusion GPS and former British spy Christopher Steele that said that Trump and his campaign were Russian agents bought and paid for, that they had participated in the DNC hacks and putting the emails onto WikiLeaks. We later found out from the Bob Mueller report that this was debunked, that this was false, that there was no evidence of a conspiracy between President Trump, his campaign, and the Russians to hack the DNC and John Podesta emails and put them onto WikiLeaks. But that not before there was top secret spying ordered by the Obama administration beginning in October of 2016 that carried over the spying of Carter Page and his contacts of contacts within the campaign, carried over into 2017. With President Trump coming into office, the Justice Department would then lie to President Trump about the extent of the investigation, even though Trump, under Article 2, is the head of the executive branch, and he's supposed to be privy to ongoing investigations by the Justice Department. Here you had a secret investigation. James Comey, former FBI director, lies to Trump about it. That's why Comey ultimately gets fired, which in turn was why a special counsel was appointed. And then ultimately the counsel found that the spying, there wasn't a basis for the spying, that there was no evidence that Trump was a Russian agent or his campaign. And now a January 2017 email that former National Security Advisor Susan Rice sent to herself shows that Obama may have been ambivalent about the process, and he may not have been made aware of it until later, much later in the process. So the FISA warrants happened in October of 2016. But Obama, he might not have found out about the spying until the end of his administration in December or January. And we noticed from an email that Susan Rice wrote to herself on she was on January 5th. There was a meeting and she wrote the email on January 20th, and the email was about a January 5th meeting in the Oval Office detailing the White House's interaction with the intelligence assessment on Russian interference in the 2016 elections, in which Rice wrote, quote, on January 5th, following a briefing by IC leadership on Russian hacking during the 2016 presidential election, President Obama had a brief follow-on conversation with FBI Director Jim Comey and Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates in the Oval Office. Vice President Biden and I were also present. According to Rice, former President Obama wanted to make certain that the investigation, which was about to be carried over to the Trump administration, would be done by the book. Per Rice's email to herself, President Obama began the conversation by stressing his continued commitment to ensuring that every aspect of this issue is handled by the intelligence and law enforcement communities, quote, by the book. The president stressed that he is not asking about initiating or instructing anything from a law enforcement perspective. He reiterated that our law enforcement team needs to proceed as it normally would by the book. From a national security standpoint, however, President Obama said he wants to be sure that as we engage with the incoming team, we are mindful to ascertain if there is any reason that we cannot share information fully as it relates to Russia. The email continued. The president asked Comey to inform him if anything changes in the next few weeks that should affect how we share classified information with the incoming team. Comey said that he would. And so from this email, it sounds like Obama might not have found out about the surveillance until months after it had already started. Else, why the warning about everything needing to be done by the book, and the CYA of not asking about, initiating, or instructing anything from a law enforcement perspective? It sounds like Obama himself may have been out of the loop and therefore on the outside looking in. Going back to this Machiavellian kind of precondition for maintaining liberty in a republic is you have Congress, they're on the outside looking in, they're not wielding power. The president, he's not fully wielding executive power. This administrative state is. So the Spygate fiasco in all likelihood could be a wholly owned and operated property of the administrative state, and with almost no oversight from the elected branches. But we'll find out soon. The Justice Department Inspector General report is coming out soon on FISA abuse. And supposedly it's going to include criminal violations by the Obama administration. But other reports are suggesting now that this report can be something of a disappointment, despite the massive abuse that occurred. I've called it an act of war, that if Attorney General Barr does not take action against those who perpetrated this fraud, this hoax on the American people, that President Trump and his campaign were Russian agents, that this sort of thing is just going to happen again by these administrative state intelligence agencies and the Justice Department. It's a real danger, I think, to the peaceful transition of power. That's what was being violated in 2016 when the spying kept on going, even after the election. And then the secret investigation carried over into the Trump administration, basically causing there to be not one but two executive branches. And I think that Comey lying to Trump about the extent of the investigation basically underscores the unaccountable administrative state led by the Justice Department and intelligence agencies that not even the president himself can rein in. If that doesn't prove that the president is on the outside looking in, then most certainly the recent impeachment coup attempt to remove Trump does, where administrative state officials at the State Department and National Security Council and intelligence agencies have sought to remove President Trump from office because he temporarily paused military assistance there while he considered whether or not Ukraine was a reliable national security partner or if they were simply too corrupt. And so here you have the administrative state with this attempt to remove President Trump from office, basically saying, oh, we don't like your policies. We don't care for your foreign policy. We think you're a Russian agent. Therefore, we're going to remove you from power. We're going to have Congress do it on our behalf. And I'll leave you with the close here. I think this is a real abuse of power and basically usurpation of the lawmaking powers under Article 1 going to these administrative state agencies, and also much of the executive powers and the implementation of laws going to these agencies and not the president. Via these new laws under the Administrative Procedures Act, FISA, the Hatch Act. It makes all of these officials very well insulated and hard to remove from office, and really hard to direct from the White House's standpoint. And I think we're seeing how this plays out now and what a danger it is to our Republican form of government. These officials believe that it is they and not the elected president who lead the executive branch and get to decide where the U.S. intervenes overseas, a complete betrayal of Article 2's vesting of executive power solely in the president. That is the problem President Trump, Attorney General William Barr, and Congress frankly face today. Executive and legislative powers are being usurped by unaccountable bureaucrats who answer to no one if they do not answer to the elected branches. The question is, what are they going to do about it? That's the commentary. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.